Dead America, The Soldier, The Day After, Part 3, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Rogers had both hands wrapped around the zombie's throat, his arms shaking as he fought to keep the gnashing teeth away from his neck. The creature thrashed and twisted on top of him, its fingers tearing at his uniform as it pressed down with everything it had. Drool and blood dripped from its mouth, spattering across Rogers' face as the gap between the ghoul's teeth and his skin shrank with every passing second. Flint scrambled to his feet from where Rogers had shoved him, ignoring the pain in his shoulder where it had caught the edge of the sorting machine. His rifle was still in his hands, but Rogers and the creature were tangled together on the floor, making a clean shot impossible. One wrong move, and the bullet would go through both of them. He closed the distance in 2 strides and grabbed the zombie by the back of its collar, hauling it upward with everything he had. The creature's grip on Rogers tore loose, its fingers ripping fabric from the private's uniform as Flint wrenched it away. The ghoul twisted in his grasp, snapping its jaws at the air between them, its legs kicking wildly as it tried to break free. Flint spun with the creature's momentum and drove it sideways into the nearest conveyor belt machine. The ghoul hit the machinery hard, its torso slamming into the metal frame where the belt fed into the sorting mechanism. The impact knocked the creature off balance, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The zombie grabbed onto the frame with both hands and began pulling itself back upright. Its vacant eyes locked onto Flint with single-minded hunger. Flint planted his boot on the creature's chest and shoved it deeper into the gap between the belt and the frame. The ghoul's upper body slid into the narrow opening where luggage would normally feed through to the sorting area. Its arms flailed inside the mechanism, smacking against rollers and guide rails as it tried to free itself. Before the creature could extract itself, Flint spotted the control switch on the side of the machine and slammed his fist down on it. The conveyor belt lurched to life with a grinding roar. The rubber belt caught the zombie's clothing and began pulling it into the mechanism. The creature let out a sound that was somewhere between a moan and a shriek as the machinery dragged it further in, the metal rollers and guides catching on flesh and bone. The noise was horrific, a grinding, crunching cacophony of rubber and steel, chewing through something it was never designed to process. The machine shuddered and strained under the load, the motor whining at a pitch that filled the entire baggage area. Sparks flew from the mechanism as metal ground against metal, and the belt stuttered and jerked as it fought to pull the creature through. The zombie's legs kicked against the frame for several more seconds before going still, the motor continuing to scream as it tried to force the obstruction through. Rogers was on his feet now, breathing hard, his face splattered with the creature's blood. He grabbed his rifle from where it had fallen and brought it up to his shoulder, scanning the area around them. His hands were shaking, but his aim was steady enough. "Thanks for that," Rogers said. "You pushed me out of the way first. We're even," Flint replied. The conveyor machine continued to grind and shriek, the motor refusing to shut down, despite the blockage jammed in its works. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off the concrete walls and metal shelving units. It bounced through every aisle and corridor in the baggage area, reaching into every shadow and gap where creatures might be lurking. And they answered. Moans erupted from all directions as every zombie in the baggage area began moving toward the source of the noise. Flint could hear them coming from the far corners of the space, their footsteps slapping against the concrete floor as they emerged from between machines and behind luggage racks. "That thing just rang the dinner bell for the whole room," Rogers said. "Get up there, now," Flint ordered. Flint grabbed the edge of a large sorting table that sat adjacent to the jammed conveyor and hauled himself up onto it. The table was bolted to the floor and built to handle hundreds of pounds of luggage, so it held his weight without issue. He reached down and grabbed Rogers by the forearm, pulling the private up beside him. From the elevated position, they had a clear view across the top of the conveyor systems and shelving units. The fluorescent lights overhead illuminated the space in flat, even light that left very few shadows at their height. It was like looking out over a maze from above, and the maze was filling up with creatures. Flint counted them as they appeared. 2 came from behind a row of shelving units on the far left, stumbling over scattered luggage as they locked onto the noise. 3 more emerged from a corridor between conveyor lines on the right, their mouths hanging open and arms outstretched. Another pair staggered out from underneath a sorting platform near the sealed loading bay door. More were coming from the back of the space, drawn out of whatever corners they had been wandering in by the relentless grinding of the jam machine. I count at least 15, and more are showing up, Flint said. 17, Rogers corrected, pointing to 2 more that had appeared near a luggage carousel further back in the space. The creatures converged on the jammed conveyor belt first, swarming around the base of the machine and clawing at the motor housing as if they could somehow get to the source of the noise. Their hands scraped against the metal casing, the sound adding another layer to the already deafening racket. When that failed to produce results, they began spreading out, their attention shifting upward to the 2 soldiers standing on the sorting table above them. The first ghoul to reach their position grabbed at the edge of the table and tried to pull itself up. Its fingers scraped against the metal surface, failing to find purchase on the smooth top. It tried again, jumping slightly to get a better grip, but the table was just high enough that the creature couldn't get the leverage it needed to climb. "They can't get up here," Rogers said. "Not yet, but if enough of them pile up against the sides, they'll start climbing over each other. We've seen them do it at the bridges," Flint said. He raised his rifle, took aim at the ghoul clawing at the table below him, and put a round through the top of its skull. The creature dropped straight down, crumpling to the floor in a heap. Rogers followed his lead, picking off a zombie that was approaching from the right side. The shot was clean, catching the ghoul between the eyes and dropping it where it stood. They fell into a rhythm, working their way through the creatures that continued to pour toward their position. Flint took the left side, Rogers covered the right, and they met in the middle whenever a ghoul approached from directly ahead. Each shot was deliberate, aimed carefully to conserve ammunition. Body shots were a waste they couldn't afford, so they waited for clean looks at the head before pulling the trigger. A pair of zombies reached the table at the same time, both grabbing at the edge and pulling themselves upward. Their combined weight tilted the table slightly, the bolts groaning against the floor. Flint kicked one in the face, knocking it backward into the second creature and sending both of them sprawling. Rogers put a round through each of them before they could recover, the shots coming in quick succession. A zombie in the remnants of a baggage handler's vest managed to get both hands on the table edge and began hauling itself upward. Its arms strained as it pulled its weight higher, the muscles still strong enough in the early hours of its transformation to generate real force. Its head appeared over the edge, jaws already snapping. Flint stepped forward and drove the butt of his rifle down onto the creature's fingers, breaking its grip with a crunch. As it fell back to the floor, Rogers put a round through its forehead before it could try again. "Good teamwork," Flint said. "I try," Rogers replied. The numbers were thinning. The initial wave of creatures that had responded to the conveyor noise had been the largest, and Flint and Rogers had cut through most of them from their elevated position. Scattered ghouls continued to appear from the deeper sections of the baggage area, drawn by the gunfire that had replaced the conveyor noise as the primary attraction. But they arrived in ones and twos rather than groups. Flint dropped a creature that emerged from behind a stack of suitcases on the far left, then shifted his aim to another that was stumbling between 2 conveyor lines near the center of the space. Rogers picked off a ghoul that had been crouched over a body near the sealed bay door, the round catching it in the temple as it stood to investigate the noise. 2 more appeared from the very back of the space, rounding the corner of a maintenance closet at a full sprint. They ran shoulder to shoulder down the center aisle, their feet slapping against the concrete in an uneven rhythm. Flint and Rogers each picked one, firing simultaneously. Both creatures dropped mid-stride, their momentum carrying them forward until they slid to a stop on the smooth floor. The jammed conveyor belt finally seized up with a metallic screech, the motor burning out under the strain. The sudden silence was jarring after the sustained noise, and the absence of the grinding left only the fading echoes of the last few gunshots hanging in the air. Flint scanned the space from his elevated position, turning slowly to check every aisle and gap between the machinery. Nothing moved. The floor around their sorting table was littered with bodies, dark pools spreading beneath shattered skulls. Further out, more corpses were draped over conveyor belts and slumped against shelving units where they had fallen. "I think that's the last of them," Rogers said, though he kept his rifle up and continued scanning. "Give it a minute," Flint replied. They stood on the table in silence, listening. The baggage area was quiet now. No moans, no footsteps, no shuffling from the shadows. The only sound was the continued pounding of the horde against the sealed loading bay door, muffled and distant through the heavy steel. Flint counted to 60 in his head before lowering his rifle. "All right, I think we're clear," he said. Rogers let out a long breath and lowered his weapon, rolling his shoulders to work out the tension that had built up during the fight. Flint ejected his magazine to check his count. He was down to his last full magazine, and whatever was left in the one currently in the rifle. Rogers checked his own supply and came up with similar numbers. "We need to make every shot count from here on out," Flint said. "Understood," Rogers replied. Both men climbed down from the sorting table carefully, keeping their rifles accessible as their boots hit the floor. The space around them was a mess of bodies, spent casings, and scattered luggage. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with the sour stench that came from the creatures. Flint walked over to the jammed conveyor and hit the control switch, shutting off the dead motor. The machine let out one final groan before falling silent. He glanced at what remained in the mechanism and looked away. There was nothing useful to see. Rogers moved through the space methodically, checking behind shelving units and under conveyor belts to make sure nothing had been missed. He nudged a body with his boot to confirm it was finished before moving on to the next aisle. It was careful, thorough work, and Flint appreciated the kid's discipline. "All clear back here," Rogers reported. Flint nodded and began looking for the interior access that Davis had described during the briefing. The baggage area had to connect to the terminal above through some kind of corridor or stairwell that the ground crews used. He moved along the back wall, past rows of equipment and stacked containers, until he spotted a heavy door marked Terminal Access, Authorized Personnel Only. "Found our way in," Flint called out. Before Rogers could respond, the radio on Flint's belt crackled to life. Davis's voice came through, slightly breathless but controlled. "Flint, do you copy?" Davis transmitted. Flint grabbed the radio and keyed it. "I copy, Captain. We're in the baggage area. Had some company waiting for us, but it's been dealt with." "Good, because we're in too. Made it through the service stairs on the east side while the horde was busy chasing you. We're on the jetway level. Just entered the terminal," Davis replied. "Any trouble getting in?" Flint asked. "A few stragglers on the stairs, nothing we couldn't handle. The bulk of them were too focused on your SUV to notice us." "Your plan worked," Davis said. "Rogers deserves half the credit. He kept us alive in here," Flint said. Rogers looked over at Flint with a surprised expression, not expecting the call-out. He gave a slight nod of acknowledgement before going back to checking the perimeter. "I'll buy him a beer when this is over," Davis replied. "Now, where are you?" "I've got a door marked for terminal access on the back wall of the baggage area. Should put us on the lower level of the building," Flint said. "Good. We need to link up before we push to the pilot's lounge. The terminal up here is a mess. Those things are everywhere," Davis said. "Understood. What's your position?" Flint asked. "We came in near Gate 12 on the east concourse. We're holding just inside the jetway entrance," Davis replied. "Copy that. We're heading up now. Flint out." He clipped the radio back onto his belt and walked over to Rogers, who was standing near the terminal access door with his rifle at the ready. "Davis and the others made it in. They're on the east concourse near Gate 12, Flint said. "So we just need to get up there and find them," Rogers said. "That's the easy part," Flint said. Rogers let out a dry laugh. "Somehow, I doubt that, Sergeant." Flint gave him a half grin before pulling the terminal access door open. A dark stairwell stretched upward beyond the threshold, the lights on the landing above flickering weakly. From somewhere higher up, echoing down through the concrete walls, came the faint sound of moaning. "After you," Rogers said. "How generous," Flint replied. He stepped through the door and began climbing the stairs, his rifle leading the way as Rogers fell in behind him and pulled the door shut at their backs. Chapter 2. The stairwell was narrow and dim, the overhead lights reduced to a weak flicker that cast more shadow than illumination. Flint led the way up, his rifle aimed at the landing above as he climbed each step with deliberate care. Rogers was 2 steps behind, covering the space below them in case anything followed them up from the baggage area. The moaning they had heard from below was louder now, drifting down from somewhere beyond the door at the top of the stairs. It wasn't the concentrated sound of a horde pressing against a barrier. It was scattered, coming from multiple directions, the sound of creatures wandering through a large open space. Flint reached the top landing and pressed himself against the wall beside the door. It was a heavy fire door with a small rectangular window set into the upper half. He rose up just enough to peer through the glass and get a look at what was waiting on the other side. The door opened onto the main concourse of the terminal. The space was wide and long, stretching in both directions with high ceilings and walls of windows that let in the daylight from outside. Under normal circumstances, it would have been filled with travelers, announcements, and the hum of a functioning airport. Now it looked like a war zone. Bodies were everywhere, scattered across the polished floor, slumped against walls, draped over rows of seating. Some had been torn apart so badly that it was difficult to tell how many people they had originally been. Blood was smeared across the floor in long streaks, as if bodies had been dragged from one location to another. Overturned luggage carts, scattered personal belongings, and abandoned food court trays added to the wreckage that covered every surface. Creatures moved through the space in loose groups. Flint counted 8 within his immediate line of sight, wandering between the rows of seating and the shuttered storefronts that lined the concourse. Some moved with purpose, following sounds or movement that only they could detect. Others stood in place, swaying slightly, their vacant eyes staring at nothing. Further down the concourse to the left, Flint spotted more ghouls near a cluster of gates, at least another dozen spread across the corridor, and beyond them, through the haze of distance and the obstruction of support columns, there were more. The terminal was crawling with them. "How bad?" Rogers whispered from behind him. "Bad? I can see at least 20 from here, and there are more deeper in. The whole concourse is full of them," Flint replied, keeping his voice low. "Which direction is Gate 12? Rogers asked. Flint looked through the window again, scanning the signs hanging from the ceiling. The gate numbers were still visible, white text on blue backgrounds. "To the right, maybe a couple 100 yards down the concourse," Flint said. "A couple 100 yards through that?" Rogers said. "We're not going through the middle. We stay along the storefronts and use the shops for cover. Some of these places have back hallways that connect to each other," Flint said. He eased the door open just enough to slip through, holding it for Rogers before letting it close softly behind them. They pressed against the wall, crouching behind a toppled display of travel pillows and neck cushions that had been knocked over near the stairwell exit. The nearest zombie was about 30 yards away, its back to them as it stood in the middle of the concourse facing the windows. Beyond it, 2 more were moving slowly between rows of seating, their feet shuffling through the debris on the floor. Flint motioned for Rogers to follow, and they began moving along the wall toward the right, staying low and using the storefronts for concealment. They passed a shuttered newsstand, then a darkened electronics store, moving carefully past each one, while keeping their eyes on the creatures in the concourse. They had covered about 50 yards when Flint spotted movement inside one of the shops ahead. It wasn't the erratic, purposeless movement of a zombie. It was controlled, deliberate, the kind of movement made by someone who was trying very hard not to be noticed. Flint held up a fist, stopping Rogers in his tracks. He crept forward to the entrance of the shop, a coffee place with tables and chairs visible through the glass front. The interior was dark, the overhead lights off, but enough daylight filtered in from the concourse to illuminate the space. 3 people were huddled behind the service counter at the back of the shop, 2 women and a man, all of them wearing the khaki pants and polo shirts of airport employees. They were pressed together against the back wall, their eyes wide as they watched the concourse through the shop windows. The front door of the shop sat ajar, the top hinge broken at the frame. There was a large smear of blood against the glass, as if someone tried to push through it in a hurry, but didn't make it. The resulting impact forceful enough to break the door. One of the women noticed Flint at the entrance and nearly screamed before clamping both hands over her mouth. The man beside her grabbed her arm, pulling her down lower behind the counter. The second woman stared at Flint's uniform and rifle with an expression that shifted from terror to desperate hope in the span of a heartbeat. Flint held a finger to his lips, signaling them to stay quiet. He glanced back at the concourse to make sure no creatures had taken notice, then slipped through the shop entrance with Rogers right behind him. They moved behind the counter where the 3 survivors were crouched. The man was middle-aged, heavy-set, with a name tag that read Victor and the title Gate Agent printed beneath it. The woman who had nearly screamed was younger, thin, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke to a night spent without sleep. Her tag read Sarah. The second woman, Pam, was older, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was the one who had recognized the uniform. "Are you here to get us out?" Pam whispered. "We're here to get the people in the pilot's lounge out, but we're not leaving anyone behind if we can help it," Flint said quietly. "Thank God," Victor said. "We've been in here since last night. Those things are everywhere out there." "How many of you are there?" Flint asked. "Just us three. There were more, but they tried to make a run for the exits a few hours ago," Sarah said. She didn't finish the sentence, and she didn't need to. "Have any of those things tried to get in here?" Flint asked. "A couple wandered in earlier, but they went right back out when they didn't find anything. As long as we stay quiet and out of sight, they leave us alone," Pam explained. Flint nodded. It tracked with what he had observed about the creatures. They were drawn to noise and movement, and without either stimulus, they lost interest and moved on. The survivors had figured that out on their own and used it to stay alive. "Okay, here's the situation. I've got a team further down the concourse near Gate 12, but there are too many of those things between us and them for us to just walk through. We need to clear a path," Flint said. "How are you going to do that?" Victor asked. "We're going to make some noise and draw them toward us. When they commit, my team hits them from behind," Flint said. The three survivors exchanged nervous glances. The idea of deliberately attracting the creatures that they had spent all night hiding from was not a comforting one. "You three stay behind this counter and don't move until I tell you it's clear. Understood?" Flint said. All three nodded. Pam reached out and grabbed Flint's arm before he could stand. "Be careful out there. Those things are fast," she said. "Yeah, I've noticed," Flint replied. He moved to the front of the shop and crouched by the entrance, pulling out his radio and keying it to Davis's channel. "Captain, I'm at a coffee shop about halfway between Gate 4 and Gate 12 on the East Concourse. I've found 3 survivors. What's your position?" Flint transmitted. Davis's response came back in a low whisper. "We're still at Gate 12. I can see the concourse from the jetway entrance. There are at least 15 of those things between your position and ours. I count about the same from here. Here's what I'm thinking. Rogers and I step out into the concourse and make some noise. The creatures between us are going to come running our way. When they do, they'll have their backs to you," Flint said. "And we catch them in a crossfire," Davis said, catching on. "That's the plan. Rogers and I engage from the front. You and the others hit them from behind. We squeeze them between us and put them down before they can get to us," Flint said. There was a brief pause on the radio. When Davis came back, his voice carried the steady tone of a decision being made. "All right, give me 60 seconds to get my people into position. I'll have Morris and Silva set up on the left side of the concourse and Butler on the right. When you hear us open fire, that's your signal that we're in the fight," Davis said. "Copy that. 60 seconds starting now," Flint replied. He clipped the radio back and looked at Rogers, who had been listening to the exchange from beside the counter. The private gave a nod and checked his rifle one more time, confirming the magazine was seated and a round was chambered. "We go out together, spread about 10 yards apart. Pick your shots and aim for the ones that get closest first," Flint instructed. "Got it," Rogers said. "And if they start to overrun us, we fall back into the shop and use the counter as a choke point," Flint added. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Rogers replied. Flint counted the seconds in his head, watching the concourse through the shop window. The creatures continued their aimless wandering, unaware that they were about to be caught between 2 groups of armed soldiers. He could see a cluster of 5 near a row of seating about 40 yards out, and another group of 3 near a shuttered restaurant on the opposite side. At 50 seconds, Flint moved to the shop entrance and positioned himself on the left side. Rogers took the right, his rifle raised and ready. The concourse stretched out before them, wide and open, with the creatures scattered across it like pieces on a board. 60 seconds. Flint stepped out of the shop and into the concourse. Rogers came out a beat behind him, spreading to the right to create distance between them. Flint raised his rifle, took aim at the nearest creature, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the terminal like a thunderclap, the sound bouncing off the high ceiling and glass walls. The targeted ghoul dropped, its skull blown apart before it could register the noise. But every other creature in the concourse did. Heads snapped toward the 2 soldiers, vacant eyes locked on, mouths fell open, and then they charged. The ghouls came from every direction, sprinting toward Flint and Rogers in a frenzy. They abandoned whatever they had been doing and converged on the source of the gunshot, pouring out from between rows of seating and around support columns. Flint and Rogers opened fire, picking off the closest creatures first. Flint dropped 2 in quick succession, each round finding its mark. Rogers put down a third that had gotten within 20 yards, the shot catching it mid-stride and sending it tumbling across the polished floor. But the horde was building momentum. More creatures appeared from further down the concourse, drawn by the sustained gunfire. They funneled into the corridor between the storefronts, creating a dense mass of sprinting ghouls that grew larger with every second. "There's a lot more than 15, Rogers shouted over the gunfire. "Just keep shooting," Flint replied. Then, from behind the advancing horde, Davis and his team opened up. The sound of 4 rifles firing in controlled bursts erupted from the far end of the concourse. The creatures at the back of the pack began dropping, bullets tearing through skulls from behind. The ghouls had no awareness of the threat at their rear, their attention fully committed to the 2 soldiers in front of them. The crossfire was devastating. Flint and Rogers continued firing from the front, while Davis, Morris, Butler, and Silva poured rounds into the back of the horde. Creatures fell in clusters, caught between the 2 groups with nowhere to go. The concourse floor became slick with blood as bodies piled up, the remaining ghouls stumbling over their fallen and into the waiting gunfire. A zombie made it within 10 yards of Flint before he put it down with a shot to the forehead. Another lunged at Rogers from behind an overturned luggage cart, and the private dropped it with a burst that nearly emptied his magazine. He ejected and slammed in his last one without breaking stride. The volume of fire from Davis's end intensified as the horde thinned out, the remaining creatures now exposed in the open concourse with no cover and no understanding of the danger behind them. Morris and Silva worked in tandem, picking off ghouls that tried to turn around and face them. Butler dropped 3 in a row from his position on the right side, each shot precise and economical. Within a minute, the last creature fell. It had been sprinting toward Flint when a round from somewhere behind it blew through the base of its skull, sending it sliding face first across the floor until it came to rest a few yards from the sergeant's boots. The concourse fell silent. Gun smoke hung in the air, drifting through the shafts of daylight that poured in through the terminal windows. Bodies littered the floor from one end of the corridor to the other, a trail of destruction that marked the killing field between the 2 groups. Flint lowered his rifle and let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Rogers did the same beside him, his chest heaving from the exertion and adrenaline. "Are we clear?" Rogers called out. "We're clear," Morris's voice echoed back from the far end. Flint turned back to the coffee shop and gave a wave to the 3 survivors still crouched behind the counter. "You can come out now. Stay close to us," Flint said. Victor, Sarah, and Pam emerged from behind the counter, stepping carefully over the debris at the shop entrance. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide as they took in the carnage that now covered the concourse floor. Sarah looked like she was going to be sick, and Victor put a steadying hand on her shoulder. Flint and Rogers began walking down the concourse toward Davis and the others, the 3 civilians following close behind. The distance between the 2 groups shrank quickly as Davis's team moved forward to meet them, stepping over bodies and spent shell casings. Davis reached them first, giving Flint and Rogers a nod before his eyes moved to the 3 survivors. "Friends of yours?" Davis asked. "Found them in the coffee shop. They've been hiding in there since last night," Flint said. Davis gave the 3 civilians a brief but genuine nod. "You're with us now. Stay behind the soldiers and do what we tell you." All 3 nodded. Pam looked like she wanted to say something more, but the sight of the dead scattered across the concourse floor seemed to have taken the words out of her. The team regrouped near Gate 12, checking ammunition and catching their breath. The crossfire had been effective but expensive. Magazines were lighter across the board, and nobody had what could be called a comfortable supply remaining. "All right," Davis said, looking down the concourse. "Let's go find the pilot's lounge." Chapter 3. The team gathered near the Gate 12 seating area. The 3 civilians huddled together on the plastic chairs, while the soldiers stood around a directory map mounted on a nearby pillar. The map showed the full layout of the terminal, both concourses and the support facilities connected to them. Davis studied the diagram, tracing routes with his finger, while Flint stood beside him, matching what they were seeing on the map with what they had observed from the helicopter. "We came in on the east concourse, which puts us here," Davis said, tapping the map. "The pilot's lounge is on the 2nd floor of the west concourse, right about here. He moved his finger across the diagram, past the central hub where the two concourses connected, and over to the opposite side of the terminal. "That's the other side of the airport," Morris noted. "It is. We have to go through the central hub and down the full length of the west concourse to reach it," Davis confirmed. "Any idea what the situation is between here and there?" Flint asked. "None. We cleared what was in front of us to get this far, but the central hub is a big open space. Food courts, shops, the security checkpoint. If there are creatures anywhere in this terminal, that's where they'll be concentrated," Davis said. Flint looked at the map for another moment before stepping back. The central hub was the kind of space that worried him the most. Large, open, with plenty of cover for creatures to linger behind, and multiple entry points that made it impossible to control every angle at once. "Then we move quiet and stay tight. No shooting unless we absolutely have to. The less noise we make, the fewer of those things we attract," Flint said. Davis nodded in agreement and turned to the group. "All right, formation stays the same. Flint on point, Morris and Butler on the flanks, Rogers and Silva covering the rear. I'll be in the middle with the civilians. We move fast but quiet. If we run into trouble, the soldiers engage while the civilians stay behind cover. Everyone clear?" Davis ordered. A round of nods came from the team. Victor, Sarah, and Pam didn't need to be told twice. They had survived the night by staying silent, and they understood the rules better than most. Flint took the lead and moved the group down the east concourse, past the carnage from the crossfire, and toward the central hub. They moved in a tight column, footsteps as quiet as they could manage on the hard floor. The concourse was empty now, the creatures that had populated it lying dead in the killing field behind them. But the further they moved from the cleared area, the more uncertain the territory became. The central hub opened up ahead of them, like a cavern. The ceiling rose to a high glass dome that flooded the space with natural light. A large food court occupied the center, with a dozen restaurant stalls arranged in a circle around a shared seating area. Shops and services lined the perimeter, most of them shuttered with their security gates pulled down. The security checkpoint sat at the far end, its X-ray machines and metal detectors standing idle. The space was not empty. Flint held up a fist and the column stopped. He crouched behind the corner of a shoe store and peered into the hub. A scattered group of zombies occupied the food court, at least 15 that he could count. Some were around the tables, one bumping into a lifeless corpse that slumped over a table in a grotesque parody of a diner at rest. Others wandered between the stalls, bumping into counters and knocking over stacked trays that clattered to the floor. Each noise drew a brief reaction from the nearby creatures before they returned to their aimless wandering. Flint studied the perimeter, looking for a route that would keep them out of the food court entirely. The shops along the outer wall formed a corridor of sorts, with enough space between the storefronts and the central seating area to move through without getting within arm's reach of the creatures. The lighting was dimmer along the perimeter too, the shuttered gates casting long shadows that would help conceal their movement. He motioned for the group to follow and began leading them along the outer wall, using the shuttered storefronts as cover. They moved in single file, each person placing their feet where the person in front of them had stepped, minimizing the chance of kicking debris or stepping on something that would give them away. A zombie in a food service uniform stood between two stalls about 20 yards to their right, its back turned as it stared at a menu board above a counter. Flint kept his eyes on it as they crept past, his hand resting on the cleaver at his belt in case the creature turned their way. It didn't. They passed without incident, and Flint allowed himself a shallow breath of relief before continuing. They were halfway around the hub when Sarah stumbled. Her foot caught the edge of a toppled sign that had been lying flat on the floor, sending it scraping across the tile with a sound that cut through the quiet like a blade. She caught herself before falling, but the damage was done. 3 heads in the food court snapped toward the noise. The creatures stared in the direction of the sound, their bodies tensed as if deciding whether to investigate. One of them took a half step forward, its head tilting to the side as it peered into the shadows along the storefronts. Flint froze, holding up a closed fist to stop all movement behind him. The entire group stood motionless. Nobody breathed. Flint could feel his heartbeat in his temples, each pulse counting off the seconds as the creatures studied the darkness where 9 people stood absolutely still. The zombie that had stepped forward let out a low moan that drew a response from the 2 beside it. For a moment, Flint was certain they were going to charge. His hand closed around the cleaver handle, ready to pull it free. Then the creature turned away. The other two followed suit, resuming their wandering as if the noise had never happened. They hadn't seen the group against the darker background of the shuttered storefronts. Flint waited another 10 seconds, counting each one in his head, before motioning the column forward. Victor reached over and steadied Sarah, who was shaking from the near miss. Pam put a hand on her back, guiding her forward as the group continued their quiet circuit of the hub. They cleared the food court without further incident, slipping past the security checkpoint and onto the west concourse. The layout mirrored the east side, a long corridor lined with gates and storefronts, with the same high ceilings and walls of windows. But the west concourse was in worse shape. More bodies, more debris, more signs of the panic that had swept through the terminal when everything fell apart. Flint led them down the corridor, checking each gate area as they passed for any sign of the pilot's lounge. The gate numbers climbed as they moved deeper into the concourse, and with them came increasing signs of conflict. Bullet casings littered the floor near Gate 22, suggesting that someone had made a stand there at some point. The shell count was significant. Hundreds of casings scattered across the tile, with dozens of bodies to match. Barricades made from overturned seating and luggage carts had been constructed across the corridor near Gate 26, though they had long since been breached and scattered. The furniture was pushed aside and broken. The luggage carts bent and dented from the force of whatever had pushed through them. It was near Gate 28 that they heard it, a low, sustained murmur that wasn't coming from any single source, but from dozens. The sound of a crowd, except the crowd wasn't human anymore. Flint slowed his pace and moved to the left wall, pressing himself against it as he crept forward. The rest of the group followed suit, spreading along the wall in a tight line. The murmur grew louder with each step, building from a distant hum to a wall of sound that filled the corridor ahead of them. Flint reached a point where the concourse curved slightly to the right, and the source of the noise came into full view. "Son of a bitch," Flint muttered. The pilot's lounge was located on the second floor, accessible by a staircase that rose from the concourse floor near Gate 30. A solid door sat at the top of the stairs, and from the scuff marks and dents covering its surface, it had been holding back a siege for some time. The siege was still very much active. At least 100 creatures were packed into the area around the base of the staircase and along the surrounding section of the concourse. They were pressed shoulder to shoulder, pushing and shoving against each other as they tried to funnel up the stairs toward the door above. The staircase itself was clogged with ghouls, some trying to climb, while others were being pushed sideways by the mass behind them. The door at the top showed no signs of giving way, but the sheer volume of creatures trying to get through it was staggering. The horde extended back from the staircase in every direction, filling the concourse from wall to wall for a good 30 yards. Some of the creatures at the outer edges had lost interest in the stairs and were milling about, bumping into each other and the walls without purpose. But the core of the mass remained focused on the door above, driven by whatever sound or scent told them that living people were on the other side of it. Davis came up beside Flint and studied the scene. His expression tightened as he processed the scale of what they were dealing with. "That's a lot more than we can shoot our way through," Davis said quietly. Davis pulled back from the corner and motioned for the group to retreat to the area around Gate 28, putting some distance between themselves and the horde. The team gathered in a tight circle, keeping their voices low. The 3 civilians stayed back, sitting against the wall where Pam kept a watchful eye on the corridor behind them. "We need to talk to whoever's inside that lounge. If they can provide any kind of support from their end, it changes the math," Davis said. He pulled out his radio and switched to the military frequency that had been designated for in-city operations. "This is Captain Davis, Wichita Airport Terminal. Is there anyone in the pilot's lounge receiving this transmission?" Davis spoke quietly into the radio. The response came back after a short delay, the voice on the other end tight with the controlled tension of someone who had been under siege for far too long. "This is Corporal Stevenson. Captain, please tell me you're nearby," Stevenson replied. "We're on the west concourse, about 30 yards from your position. We can see the staircase and the crowd outside your door," Davis said. "Thank God. We've been up here since yesterday. We heard gunfire from the other side of the terminal, and we're hoping it was a rescue team," Stevenson said. "It is. How many do you have in there?" Davis asked. 8 total, 5 soldiers including myself, 2 pilots, and a maintenance tech. Everyone's alive, but we've got wounded. One of my men took a bad bite during the initial retreat to the lounge. He's stable for now, but he's getting worse, Stevenson reported. The mention of the bite drew a look between Flint and Davis. They both knew what that meant, and they both knew this wasn't the time to address it. "What's your ammunition situation, Corporal?" Davis asked. There was a pause before Stevenson answered. The hesitation told them everything before the words did. "We're out, Captain. Completely dry. We burned through everything we had, holding the door during the first wave. For the last 12 hours, the only thing keeping those things out has been the lock and the fact that they can't figure out how to turn a handle," Stevenson said. Davis closed his eyes for a beat, absorbing the information. When he opened them, he looked at Flint with an expression that confirmed what they had both suspected. "So they can't help us from inside. Everything has to come from out here," Davis said. "That's what I figured," Flint replied. Davis relayed the full situation to the rest of the team. Morris shook his head slowly, running through the math that everyone else had already done. Butler leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his expression grim. Silva kept glancing back down the concourse toward the horde, as if expecting the creatures to discover them at any moment. Rogers spoke up first. "Is there another way into the lounge? A back entrance, a window, anything we can use?" Davis keyed the radio again. "Corporal, is there any other access to the lounge besides the main staircase?" "Negative, Captain. One way in, one way out. The windows are reinforced and don't open. The only entrance is the door at the top of those stairs," Stevenson replied. "Copy that. Hang tight, Corporal. We're working on it," Davis said. "We're not going anywhere, Captain. But whatever you're planning, the sooner the better. Morale up here is running on fumes," Stevenson said. Davis clipped the radio to his belt and looked at the group. The problem was laid out in front of them, with brutal clarity. "Ideas?" Davis asked. "We could try pulling them away, like we did with the SUV on the airfield," Silva suggested. "With what? We don't have a vehicle in here, and on foot we'd be overrun before we got 10 yards, Morris said. "What about a fire? We pull an alarm, set off the sprinklers, and see if the noise draws them off," Butler offered. "It might pull some of them, but I don't think we're getting all of them, especially the ones who are up on the second floor already," Flint said. The group fell quiet, each of them turning the problem over in their minds. The muffled moaning from down the concourse filled the silence, a constant reminder of the wall of dead flesh standing between them and the mission. Before anyone could offer another suggestion, Morris held up a hand and pointed back down the concourse toward the horde. His expression had shifted from thoughtful to alarmed. Flint followed his gaze and felt his stomach tighten. On the outer edge of the mass, where the creatures that had lost interest in the stairs were milling about, half a dozen ghouls had turned to face down the concourse in their direction. They weren't looking at anything specific yet, but something had drawn their attention, a scent carried on the ventilation, a faint sound, or just the instinct that something living was nearby. One of the creatures took a step toward them, then another. The others followed, breaking away from the horde and beginning to move down the concourse. Their pace started as a walk, shoulders rolling and heads tilting as they scanned the corridor ahead. But within seconds, it accelerated. Their mouths fell open, their arms came up, and they locked onto the group near Gate 28. They broke into a full sprint. "Contact!" Morris hissed. 6 ghouls were racing down the corridor toward them, and behind them, the commotion was starting to draw the attention of more creatures at the edge of the horde. Heads were turning, bodies were shifting. The ripple effect was spreading through the mass like a stone dropped in still water. Davis looked at the charging ghouls, then at the horde behind them that was beginning to stir, then at his team. "Weapons down. Take them quiet or we lose the whole concourse."